personal connection with each of you, since most of you have been through the numerous trainings we've done in the last couple months. We're here to talk about implicit bias, creating a culture of diversity and inclusion. And I want to say that this is the always, anytime I'm doing kind of a series of trainings, I always prefer ending with this because this is kind of like the cherry on the top. We have a good understanding of the law, how to deal with problematic employees, how to do effective performance management. And now we're going to put sort of the glue, if you will, that's going to bring this all together and really get our employees to be productive, successful, willing to lend a helping hand, go in that extra yard. Now, what makes this training workshop a little different from others is I'm not going to espouse any rules, any legal concepts that we need to understand. This is really all about leadership and teamwork skills. And we're all going to go on a little journey, and each of you is going to have a different and unique experience. So it's not like I'm setting forth best practices on how to deal with specific situations. This is very much going to be a very self introspective type of situation, because ultimately, as a leader, you have to effectively motivate and get your employees to give 100%, to love their job, to go that extra mile. And as you'll see, what we're really talking about here is how to effectively communicate with your employees. Now, one thing I do want to emphasize, and we'll be talking a lot about biases here today. I'll be sharing with you some of my biases. And I do want you to think about your biases because you all have biases. But I'm going to ask you, and I think this is critically important, do not share your biases at work. In this forum, it's fine because we don't work together. But in the workplace, I think it could be awkward and uncomfortable for you if you readily admit some of your biases in the workplace, because your employees may react rather negatively to that. So, in terms of the agenda today, we're going to start off by talking about diversity and inclusion, what that means for your workplace, why it is essential that we create a diverse and inclusive culture where everybody feels appreciated, valued, respected, everybody feels safe and welcome so they can be their true, authentic selves. We're then going to talk about the value of diversity and inclusion, and I will be sharing with you some stories, at least my experience, of how the failure to create a diverse and inclusive workplace can result in a lot of problems, particularly litigation. Um, how might implicit bias impact your ability to create an inclusive and diverse workplace? And I would like to say that implicit bias is really what really impedes or prevents us from truly creating an inclusive workplace. And then lastly, we're going to talk about micro messages. Now, some of you may have heard of microaggressions or micro inequities, but microaggressions are communications, oftentimes subtle, usually unconscious or unknowing, that reflect our biases. And these micro messages can have very debilitating and adverse impacts on some of your employees. So I actually want to start by get you thinking a little about the culture in your workplace. And I'm going to ask you to think, all of you to yourselves, what are your top three workplace priorities in 2021? Okay, just think about what your priorities are. Just going to give you 30 seconds or so to think about that. And then once you have the priorities, I have to ask, what is your most important resource for accomplishing your priorities? All right, does anybody want to share? I will call on you. So, and if you speak up now, then I probably won't call on you later when we get to some of the more tricky scenarios. Jennifer DeLuca, you there? Can you take yourself off mute, Jennifer? Jennifer's playing hard to get. Marlene, I see your mic is open. Marlene, you there?
I'm here. Yeah.
Great, Marlene. So just share with us briefly. It doesn't have to be anything complete. What are your top three priorities for this year?
Well, I guess I didn't speak up right away. You mean like at work, in my
At work.
workplace? Well, I'm an outreach coordinator, so my top priorities are helping seniors live independently, putting in place what they need.
Okay, great. And what is the most important resource for accomplishing that?
My most important. It sounds self-serving, but I want to say right off the bat is listening to them.
Well, I like
So
that.
I understand what they need, what they're coming to me for. So then I know how to um, go like attack my resources.
Okay. I like that, being a good listener. And actually, that's one of the things I'm going to harp on later. So someone wrote in the book, open communication, feeling heard, safety. And I'm assuming for those of you that particularly play the role of managers and supervisors, your most important resource is going to be your employees, right? Your employees. Because after all, how can you be successful in your job if you're a manager or supervisor unless your employees are successful? And frankly, most supervisors and managers, the only reason we can really assess your performance is if your employees are doing a good job. So I'm going to emphasize that more often than not, a most important resource is going to be our employees. So the question is, how do we motivate our employees? Now, I want to take a little trip, and I have a little trip to my favorite city in the United States. And my favorite city in the United States is New Orleans. Anybody here been to New Orleans? New Orleans? I love New Orleans. I get there whenever I can, because New Orleans is just such a melting pot of so many great flavors, ethnicities, cultures. And if you want to really experience the great thing about New Orleans, it is the food, probably the best food, in my opinion, the best food in the United States, and maybe one of the best foods in the world. Incredible music. You go around the town, particularly the French Quarter, the old town, and you'll hear music on every corner, kids just playing incredible jazz, just looking for dollars thrown into their music boxes. And architecture, it's one of the few places in the United States we can really see exquisite Frank architecture right here in the city. So there's a lot of wonderful things about New Orleans. And one of my favorite things in New Orleans is gumbo, which basically is a dish that basically took all the leftovers of the previous meal and made it into a soup. And it is spicy Cajun, and it is has a lot of wonderful complex flavors to it. And when we're talking about diversity and inclusion gumbo, there's actually three key ingredients. And the first ingredient is equal employment opportunity, EEO. It is our policies, it is our laws with respect to discrimination and harassment. So we define discrimination, harassment. Well, discrimination is considering a protected characteristic of making an employment decision. Harassment is any hostile, offensive, inappropriate conduct based on a protected characteristic. And these are the protected characteristics I think we've talked about repeatedly. So obviously, we cannot create a diverse and inclusive culture where people feel appreciated, valued, respected. People feel safe and welcome. People can be their true, authentic selves if we engage in discrimination harassment or we don't address these discrimination harassment issues. It's impossible to create a diverse and inclusive culture where people feel appreciated, valued, respected if we allow discrimination harassment to exist, right? And I think everybody understands that. But it's now time to add our second ingredient to diversity and inclusive gumbo, and that is diversity. Diversity. Now, people think of diversity as being this touchy-feely, politically correct concept, but diversity is actually an economic philosophy that starts with the premise each and every one of us is different, each and every one of us is unique. And it's not just differences based on race, sex, national origin, sexual orientation. It's every which way we are different. What are our politics? Where did we grow up? Were we raised in a big family, small family? Did we go to private school, public school, homeschool? What are our hobbies? What are our interests? What kind of books we read, movies we watch, music we listen to? What do we like to do for exercise, etc.? What TV shows we watch? And each and every one of us has had different and unique life experiences, makes us all truly different and unique from each other. And what diversity is all about is leveraging those differences, leveraging our unique characteristics to create success, to create success. So, for example, let's say your senior center is dealing with a big problem, bring issues. Do we want everybody sitting in the room that's working on these issues that thinks the same way, acts the same way, approaches problems the same way? Or you do want a diverse group sitting around a table, offering different suggestions, perspectives on how to address that issue? Well, of course, we want a diverse perspective. Also, if we're going to really meet the needs of all our seniors, our clientele, our stakeholders, isn't it going to be more productive to have people resembling them in our workplace? So ideally, our workplace will be representative of obviously the community we serve. Now, one of the reasons why I have to emphasize the importance of diversity is oftentimes, in many organizations, if you talk like us, walk like us, dress and groom like us, act like us, and think like us, then you can be one of us. That is the opposite of diversity. Diversity is embracing differences, embracing unique characteristics, and realize we can be more successful as an organization if we embrace the concept that everybody's different and unique, and everybody can bring something different, unique into the organization to help it be successful. And every economics study done in the last 40 years has indicated the more gender diverse an organization is, the more successful it's going to be. The more ethnically diverse an organization is, the more successful it's going to be. The more racially diverse an organization is, the more successful it's going to be. So whether it be from a core value point of view, from a productivity point of view, uh, or purely a success point of view, we need to embrace diversity, have diversity goals, milestones, initiatives. Now, that being said, your workplace may be diverse in many, many different ways. But if truly going to get people to be appreciated, valued, respected, we now have to add the last ingredient. And the last ingredient is inclusion. Inclusion. Inclusion is a sense of belonging. It's feeling like you're part of the team. It's being appreciated, valued, respected for who that person truly is. It's getting a level of support and energy and commitment from others so they can reach their full potential. Because when people feel appreciated, valued, respected, safe, and welcome, they're going to love coming to work. They'll give 100%. They're more willing to lend a helping hand. They'll be more creative, inventive, industrious, productive, successful. So the key to getting employees to give 100%, go that extra mile, be productive and successful, is create this inclusive environment where people feel like they're an integral part of the team. So, but there's unfortunately something, and I should say, and obviously, research has shown diverse and inclusive workplaces lead to better service and solutions, not only for stakeholders and residents, but a better experience for all concerns. And one way to think of diversity and inclusion is diversity gives everyone access into the organization. Diversity is the invitation to the dance, but inclusion gives everybody the opportunity to succeed. Inclusion is we appreciate and value everyone when they're up on the dance floor. Now, unfortunately, however, sometimes instead of creating an inclusive workplace, we create an exclusive workplace where people do not feel appreciated, valued, respected. And usually the first sign of an exclusive workplace is people start what we call checking out. Checking out. They may be coming to work on time. They may be given about 70, 75% of their abilities, but they're not working as hard as they should. They're not going that extra mile. They're not being as productive, industrially successful as they should be. And the reason why that employee is checking out is because what's going through that employee's mind is they're thinking to themselves, why should I bust my behind if I'm not appreciated and valued by my manager or my coworkers? So when employees start feeling excluded, usually they express feelings of being left out, put down, excluded, or marginalized. Gradually, then maybe suddenly feeling invisible, not valued. Okay. And that's usually the first sign if we have an exclusive workplace where people just start checking out, not working as hard as they should. Unfortunately, however, sometimes employees feel so excluded, so not appreciated, so not valued that now they're in EEO territory. Then now they perceive they're being treated differently based on protected characteristics such as race, sex, national origin, and they allege discrimination harassment. You would be amazed of how many lawsuits for discrimination harassment get filed that truly have nothing to do with discrimination harassment and everything to do with being excluded, not feeling appreciated, valued, an integral part of the team. So I'm actually going to share with you a story. It's a case I was involved with many years ago. I was representing a company that was sued by an employee for gender and age discrimination. The plaintiff employee was a 50-year-old woman. And what was sort of interesting about this case was the managers thought this woman was a great employee, and they were really shocked and totally dismayed that she would file a complaint for age and gender discrimination. And this case settled, as most cases, lawsuits settled, literally on the courtroom steps as we're going to a hearing. And after the case settled, my client and I went up to this woman's lawyer and said, do you mind if we have a discussion with your client? We just want to get a sense of what motivated her, what inspired her to file this lawsuit. Lawyer said, fine. So we go up to this woman, excuse me, and we said, we just want to get a sense of what happened. So one incident, was it many incidents, but really just want to get a sense of what motivated you to file this lawsuit. And this woman turned beet red and she clenched her fist like this. And you can see the smoke coming out of her ear. And she pointed to her manager standing down the hallway and said, that SOB didn't invite me to his holiday party. Didn't invite her to the holiday party. And I'll readily admit that my biases were working. And the first thing that I assumed was this woman was crazy. My biases were because you file a lawsuit for age and gender discrimination because he didn't get invited to a party. But then we started looking into it in a little more detail. And what we discovered is the manager here used to come to work first thing in the morning, interact, engage with all the other employees, never engage with her. The manager throughout the day would go into other person's offices and just, talk about whatever, politics, religion, family, vacation plans, never went into her office and engaged with her. Around 10 o'clock, 10:30 every morning, the manager made a run to the local Dunkin' Donuts and used to go around the office asking people, do you want anything from Dunkin' Donuts? Never asked her. The female employee actually recalled a situation where she and the manager were in the hallway talking something about work. And as employees walking by, the manager would say, hey, I'm going to Dunkin' Donuts. You want to join me? Never asked her. The manager asked employees to join him at lunch. Never asked her. The manager asked employees to go to happy hours after work. Never asked her. The manager invited employees over to his house for picnics and barbecues. Never asked her. This woman felt so excluded, so not appreciated, so not valued that she internalized it must be because he's a woman 50 years of age. And we went to the supervisor and said, well, why did you exclude her? Why didn't you engage, effectively communicate with her? And the manager was, well, she was doing such a great time and she was kind of a loner, so I just let her be. But it is absolutely essential that we engage and effectively communicate. So if we do want to get people to so-called the top of the mountain, where they're being hardworking, successful, industrious, what is absolutely essential is you create positive, meaningful, and trusting relationships with each and every coworker. This is the key to creating an inclusive workplace, making people feel appreciated, valued, respected, creating positive, meaningful, trusting relationships, engaging employees to the point where they feel like they're an integral part of the team. Now, I was doing a training workshop a couple of years ago just on diversity and inclusion. And a manager in the back of the class raised their hand and said, Ed, are you saying I have to invite everyone on my team to my daughter's wedding? No, that is not what I'm saying, because each and every employee is unique. Each and every employee is different. So your relationships with your employees and coworkers can be different. Maybe some employees you chit chat about family, others about sports, others about politics, others about religion. Maybe some employees you put on your sneakers and do a walk during lunch. Maybe some employees you belong to book clubs with or sewing clubs with. Maybe some employees you go to the gym, you go out for drinks after work. You can have different and unique relationships with your employees. The key, though, is to create a positive, meaningful, trusting relationship with each and every coworker. That is the key to making them feel appreciated, valued, respected. Now, I've realized I've been talking kind of fast. Does anybody have any questions at this point? And feel free to chime in or just type any questions into the chat box. That would be great. Now, unfortunately, there's something that gets in the way of creating this diverse and inclusive work environment, and that is biases. Biases. Now, bias is defined as an inclination of temperament and outlook, a personal and sometimes unreasoned judgment. Unreasoned judgment. So, for example, as you may be able to tell, I was born and raised in New York. I sort of have a slight New York accent, and I'm a diehard New York Yankee fan. So every time I see someone wearing a Boston Red Sox hat, I immediately think that person's a bum. Okay. It's one of my biases. It's not sound. It's not reasonable in any way, shape, or form. But that is my outlook on life. You're a Red Sox fan, you're a bum, right? But we also have what we call implicit biases. And these are learned stereotypes that operate automatically and unconsciously when we interact with people. And they absolutely impact our conscious decisions. And the thing about implicit biases is usually we don't even know when we're manifesting our implicit bias because they are usually unconscious, unknowing. Now, I'm going to get into a kind of pseudo uh, uh, biopsychological discussion of how these biases develop. And of course, I'm a lawyer, so it's going to be pretty much rudimentary. All right. Now, in order to understand how these biases develop, I want you to think of your brain being in two parts. Two parts. The first part is our conscious mind. And our conscious mind is very deliberate. It is very logical. It is also very slow. So when we are truly focused on one particular task, a lot of times we use the term in the zone, it is our relying on our conscious mind. So the example I like to give is, let's say we're driving our car on a highway during a terrible thunderstorm or during a really bad snowstorm, as we New Englanders know too well. And you are gripping the handle, the steering wheel at 10 and 2. You're totally focused on what's going on in the road. You're sensitive to all the cars and trucks moving about you. You know, the music may be blaring, people may be talking, but you're totally focused on the road. In fact, sometimes you yell at your family, hey, be quiet, or you turn the radio off because you want to dedicate all of your mental energy into driving that car. But now we have the other side of our brain, and that is our unconscious mind. And our unconscious mind is where our emotions are, and it operates incredibly fast, almost automatically, involuntarily, and it's associative. What I mean by that? Well, when we experience things that we've experienced in the past, our mind immediately associates certain sensations and mental images. So, for example, let's change our driving situation. Let's say we're driving on a beautiful summer day. We roll down the window. We got our arm out, hanging out the window. We're blasting tunes, maybe having conversations with people on our cell phone, hands free, of course. We may have people in the car that we're having gauges with, and you're driving maybe 65, 70 miles an hour on the highway, but you are seem to be oblivious to everything that's going on around you, but yet you're passing cars, you're maintaining speed, you're putting on the brakes, but you are not focusing really at all of what's going on on the road. In fact, you may be thinking of, you know, who you're going to see at the party this weekend, what are you going to make for dinner, what are you going to when do you have to get the kids? In fact, your mind is thinking about everything else except the driving. Do you ever have those situations? Because I have them frequently, where I get from point A to B, such as from my office to my home, and I realize, did I actually drive in my car? I mean, because I didn't spend a second of my conscious thought thinking about the driving. I was thinking about something related to work, family, etc. And that's because our unconscious mind was doing the driving. We have so much experience that we've actually trained our unconscious mind to do the driving for us. And what I just point out, while the unconscious mind is great because it does the driving for us, more often than not, when you get into an accident, it's because you were driving with your unconscious mind as opposed to a conscious mind. You're focusing on the radio or the tunes or whoever you're talking on the cell phone or whatever else is going on in the car, except what's going on the road. So the unconscious mind is great because it helps us do so many things. It helps us multitask, right? It allows us to go about our day doing hundreds of different things. But because we're not totally conscious or focused on it, that's when we tend to make mistakes. And this is where biases are created. Biases are created in our unconscious mind because, again, biases operate automatically, almost instinctively, and incredibly fast. So, just to give you some more just background of what I'm talking about, our human brain, takes in on average 11 million bits of information a minute. So you are obviously focusing on my voice now. You may be looking at me in the screen, but your body, all your stimuli in your body is picking up rather sensations. Is it warm? Is it cold? Other sounds in the office? Or what does your home look like? So our human brain takes in up an incredible amount of information every minute. But our conscious mind can only focus on 40, 40 bits of information a minute. That's it. That's it. That's why our conscious mind works so very slow, and it is deliberate. But if our brain is taking in all this information, how is it processed? How is it processed? Well, our brain, our unconscious mind categorizes and associates all the information that your five senses are taken into account. And it kind of puts it in file cabinets, categories. Is this positive or negative? Are we in group, out group, safe and dangerous, comfortable and uncomfortable? And as we go through life, as we experience something, immediately our unconscious mind is going to associate what we're sensing with something that's already been categorized or cataloged in our brain. So to understand how it works, I need a volunteer. And Chris Hoddle, I'm going to pick on you only because you're in Provincetown. That's all. That's the only reason I'm picking on you. Chris, you there?
I am here.
All right, Chris, I want you to think back to when you were an infant, right? I don't expect you to remember intimate details, but just think back. And I just want to get a sense of what your childhood was like when you were growing up. Was there one parent that was the primary caregiver when you were an infant?
Yes.
And who was that?
Mom.
Mother. As in most families, it's usually the mother. All right. So, Chris, let's say, hypothetically speaking, you're an infant, you're maybe up to a year old, and you were really hungry. What do you think you did?
Cried.
Cried, of course, cried. And by the way, I'm a new grandparent, so I'm living this all over again. Okay, just
Aw.
literally, my grandchild's going to be a month old at the end of this week.
Oh,
So I'm
congratulations.
experienced. Thank you. So I'm living this whole thing. So you cried, and I have no doubt your mother picked you up. She fed you, made you feel nourished. She held you tight, made you feel warm and cuddly. She was nurturing you. She may sing to you or talk to you. And as a baby, you're having a wonderful, blissful, nurturing experience. And everything about that experience is being categorized in your unconscious mind. It could be your mother's voice, the color of her hair, the words or song she's using, everything. Your mind is taking that whole incredible experience and categorizing it as something positive and wonderful. And I have no doubt when you go through your life, particularly as a child, when you see someone who looks like your mother, it's automatically going to trigger something positive. When you hear someone who sounds like your mother, it's going to trigger something as positive. Okay. And that's how our mind works. It takes these stimuli and it categorizes it, whether this is a good, wonderful experience or a bad, negative experience. Right. So to share with you the story, and this is actually something came up at a training workshop I was doing not too long ago. There was a a husband. He just had a child. The child was about a year old, and the man was the primary caregiver for their newborn, and he was Asian, Japanese actually, and the woman was white. The wife was wife and American. And interestingly, again, the husband, the Japanese husband, was the primary caregiver. He's the one who picked up the kids primarily when they're crying. He played the role of, for lack of better terms, Mr. Mom. And interestingly, when members of the father's family showed up, the Japanese side of the family showed up, and the family members held the kid was very warm and responsive, smiled, giggled, had seemed to have a wonderful time. However, when a family member from the mother's side, the white American side person came over, when the family member held the kid cried, kind of screamed, and looked very uncomfortable. Why? Because that infant had associated positive biases towards the father, because he's the one who provided the natural the nurturing as growing up, and had a negative reaction towards people who are different. And that's how our mind works. We tend to have positive associations with people that we've had positive relationships with in the past, and negative people either we haven't experienced or we've had negative experiences in the past. And by the way, this is not just a human brain situation. All mammals have it. At its most simplistic stage, we have whether an animal or mammal, I should say, should fight, flee, or freeze. That is your implicit biases. That's your unconscious mind. All of a sudden, you get a stimuli and react immediately. React immediately. Now, as we're talking about, these implicit biases are so well established that they operate without awareness, intention, or control. So think about driving on the road when you're not spending any time focused on it. We've had so many associations with driving on a highway that our unconscious mind can do it for us, right? And that's really how our mind works. So because our unconscious mind works so fast, okay, oftentimes our biases come out before we even realize it. Because again, our unconscious mind works immediately, automatically. And sometimes our biases come out when we engage or communicate with each other. Now, I want to emphasize that biases are not prejudiced. Each and every human being has biases. Infants as young as 6 months of age to develop biases, but they only turn into prejudices when they're subject to cultural, media, family, historical, environmental, and societal factors, our personal experiences. No baby is born with prejudice. They do develop biases. That is a total human biological reaction. But whether or not these biases turn into prejudices depend on the social and environmental factors that the kids are subject to. So let me share with you some research on implicit bias. How do we know these biases exist? Well, share with you that's one near and dear to my heart because it involves judges, the legal aspect, and the whole thing, whether the color of the defendant made a difference in what sentences were given to criminal defendants. So California came with this research project to show whether there's a racial bias in sentencing. And each judge was given a folder that contained information about a criminal defendant. And everything was identical except for two variables. One was a photo of the criminal defendant. And in some folders, it had a photo of a Black criminal defendant, some a white criminal defendant, some a Latino criminal defendant. And the other variable was the name. So they had names associated with African Americans, Blacks, names associated with Latinos, names associated with white Caucasians. That was it. Everything else in the folder was exactly the same. And just based on either the name of the defendant or the color of the defendant got a stricter sentence. So it showed that Blacks and African Americans in the survey actually got stiffer, longer sentences than whites, and Latinos are right in the middle. So if everything in that folder about that individual's past is identical, how do you explain the Black criminal defendants getting the longer sentences? It was biases. The judges had biases. In fact, what is really interesting is the Black judges actually gave the Black defendants longer sentences as well. The judges had biases just based on the color of that person's skin and their name. Something in their mind was triggering them to give these defendants longer sentences, biases. Symphony orchestras. Symphony orchestras were routinely known or accused of being biased against women. For years and years, symphony orchestras were overwhelmingly male dominated. And then they started to do what they call blind auditions. And initially, what they did is there was a curtain down, so you couldn't see the applicant. You couldn't see the musician. But the musician would walk on stage, sit down, and play the instrument. Now, initially, the blind auditions, males were still being selected as the best, giving the best audition. Anybody want to guess why? Why the males were still being picked over the females? Well,
Was it because of the shoes they were wearing?
Exactly, Michael, the heels. The heels. The judges, the people in the orchestra, when they heard the person walk across, they could tell whether or not that musician had heels. So thus, they were able to actually tell without seeing whether it's a male or female. And as a result, they were still choosing the males as the best musicians. But then they started with a totally blind audition where the musician would be sitting behind the curtain at their instrument, and then the judges would walk in. And amazingly, when you really could not absolutely not tell whether that musician was male or female, the number of women selected as the best musician went up by 50%. 50%. And now all of the big symphony orchestras do blind auditions. Why? Because of biases. For some reason, the judges always assumed that the male was the best musician. Right? How about this one is a fascinating one. It was actually done at Yale University. Now, it is a fact that African-American male students are disciplined more often and more severely than white students or girls, right? It's just a fact. In the public schools, Black African-American students gets disciplined more often and more severely. Now, when they were looking at this issue, the initial explanation was there must be some genetic predisposition to the Black boys acting out. And that has been totally dismissed, totally debunked. It showed that it's determined that there is no difference in genetic code that has an influence on these boys acting out. And then the research started to focus on, well, it must be something about the socioeconomic aspects of these kids, whether these Black boys were living in a more poverty, lower second socioeconomic class, poor housing, maybe single parent households, things like that. But then when you compare that to white boys who had the similar type of low socioeconomic status, poverty, poor housing, single parent household, again, the Black boys were still being disciplined more severely. And then the focus came down to, well, maybe it's not the kids, maybe it's the teachers, that the teachers have some bias. And as a result of those biases, they were disciplining the Black boys more often. So Yale University created this environment, basically this studio, a pseudo teaching facility, so to speak, where they had kids, very diverse, Black boys, Black girls, white girls, sitting in a room, and they were all doing a task like painting, coloring, something like that. And they brought in these preschool teachers, and all the preschool teachers had this device. It was actually fitted onto a pair of glasses that could actually measure who the teachers were looking at. So they could statistically determine who the teachers focused on. Now, even though all the kids were doing the exact same task, none of the kids were acting out or doing anything unique or different. The teachers spent 48% of their time focusing on the Black boys. The next group was the white boys. I believe it was 27%. Then came the white girls, which I believe were 17%. And then the Black girls got the least amount of attention, 12%. Well, if all the kids were doing the exact same thing and none of the kids were acting out, why were the preschool teachers focusing predominantly on the Black boys? And what's even interesting is the Black teachers focus predominantly on the Black boys. It's biases. These teachers have biases that were impacting who they are focusing on paying attention to. Now, the last reach I want to talk about is parental favoritism. Now, I have no doubt if I ask any of you who have children, do you show favoritism to the boys or the girls that you've raised? I have no doubt you would say, no, I love them equally. I devote equal amount of attention to love to each of my children, whether they be boy or girl. Unfortunately, science has shown that that's not true. It has absolutely been established by research that fathers tend to spend more time with and dote on more favorably on the boys, and the mothers tend to spend more time with and dote more favorably on the girls. And it even comes down to giving allowances. The fathers tend to give the boys a larger allowance. The mothers tend to give the girls larger allowance, right? There is actually parental favoritism. But why? I mean, you would never admit, and you would probably, even if you took a lie detector test, you probably would pass if you said, I treat my kids equally, I don't show favoritism. But the truth of the matter is you do. You do. We all do. And that is because our biases, something in our unconscious mind is going to have us provide more favorable treatment towards the child that is of the same sex, right? So these studies show implicit bias exists. So let's do a little exercise. And what we're going to do here is we are going to have a couple of applicants view into the room. Of course, this is, and what I want you to do is tell me the very first thing that pops in your mind when you're aware that these applicants have some unique features. So, for example, our very first applicant has a weak, soft handshake. Weak, soft handshake. Donna Marie, what is the first thing that's going to pop into your mind?
Oh, God. Perhaps they're indecisive, not able to make decisions, reserved.
Okay. How about um, uh, let's see, Trish Pope. What's the first thing that's going to pop in your mind?
That they might be gay.
They might be gay. Okay, interesting. All right, let's now go to our second applicant. And this applicant has a strong, assertive handshake. Amy Waters, what's the first thing that's going to pop in your mind? Amy, you there? What's the first, anybody want to share with me? What's the first thing that popped in your mind?
They're an athlete.
They're an athlete. Okay. I like that. All right.
Confident.
Confident, assertive. Yes, absolutely. All right. How about this? An applicant comes in and they have a little something in their teeth. Michael, what's the first thing that's going to cross through your mind?
They just had lunch.
They just had lunch, right? I mean, come on, they got to look in the mirror. You go into an interview with a little something green. I mean, and it's the type of thing where you want to look away, but you can't help looking. Kind of uncomfortable, particularly for you as the interviewer to have to see that. All right, how about this? An applicant comes in with a huge coffee stain on their shirt. What's the first thing that's going to cross your mind?
They're disorganized.
Disorganized, sloppy. Of course, to be honest with you, every day that I get a coffee, I usually show up at work with a coffee stain on my shirt. But why did we have those immediate responses? Because something in our unconscious mind was associating a weak, soft handshake with someone who's maybe not confident, insecure, as someone indicated, gay, or someone who has a strong, assertive handshake as someone who is confident, maybe an athlete or someone who works out. But truth of the matter is, okay, does that really make a difference in whether or not they're best qualified candidate for the job? Someone has something in their teeth. We've all had that experience, right? We've all had that experience. Or a huge coffee stain in their shirt. So why am I harping on this? Because studies have shown that when an applicant comes into an interview, the manager conducting an interview determines whether they like and want to hire someone or don't like and don't want to hire someone within the first 30 seconds. The first 30 seconds. So what happens in the first 30 seconds of an interview? We hear the person's voice, we shake their hand and look them up and down. That's it. That's it. And we're determining whether we like and want to hire this person within the first 30 seconds. But we have not entered into a discussion of their skills, their abilities, their education, whether or not they're best qualified candidate for the job. And unfortunately, it's our unconscious mind that's making those decisions. Unconscious mind is immediately assessing because they have a weak handshake, strong handshake, something in their teeth, or a huge coffee stain, that they would be a good or a bad candidate, and we're deciding not to hire one. Now, I want to share with you.
Can I ask a question real quick on that?
Absolutely.
I know it's the unconscious mind they're referring to, but is there a way to know that you're having those thoughts, like to bring them to your in that moment? So, because when I've gone in and interviewed people, I'm certainly not aware of the fact that I've made a decision in the first 30 seconds. But
Sure.
How would I know and therefore prevent that from happening in that situation?
So ultimately, when you're determining who you want to hire, you should always be focused on who's the best qualified candidate for the job. And you should be able, you got to ask yourself, is there credible, observable facts that justify me hiring this person or justify me not hiring? Credible, observable facts. Okay. So by focusing your mind on that, you will get away from these first impressions, because first impressions are almost always our unconscious bias at work. But if we instead use our conscious mind and focus on credible, observable facts, we're more likely to really objectively determine who's the best qualified candidate for the job. And I'm going to get into that in more detail in just a little bit. Now, I want to share with you one of my biases, and that is I have always had a bias against a negative bias towards people who have multiple tattoos and piercings. I have no idea where it came from. I don't know if the kids who beat me up at middle school and touched my lunch money had tattoos and piercings. It may have something to do with my grandmother actually telling me when I was really young, you know, if you have tattoos and piercings, you can't be buried in a Jewish cemetery. Okay. I have no idea, but I've always had a negative reaction toward tattoos and piercings. In fact, I actually became conscious and aware that when I walked by tattoo parlors on the street, I'd immediately get out a little anxious, right? And so absolutely, and I have no idea how that bias came up. But as I will talk about a little later, my son, a few years back, he spent a semester in Europe. He spent 6 months in Dublin, Ireland. And he came back from Ireland with a long sleeve tattoo. And he brought home his girlfriend who had one of these septum nose piercing. And I love my son more than anything. His girlfriend was a lovely woman. And I actually had to strive to overcome your biases, my bias, excuse me. And you actually can do that. One of the things I'm going to harp on just a little ways, you actually can overcome your biases if you recognize they exist. Recognize they exist, right? So in order to, and Amy, I'm actually going to get to your question in just a minute. How these biases develop, how our mind actually works, and how that impacts our decisions in the workplace. Data comes into our mind, our senses, and we're not even aware of it because it happens so immediately, such as the strong handshake, the weak handshake, little thing in the teeth, the coffee stain, the tattoos and piercings. That type of data stimuli immediately. And within less than a second, that data goes through our filters. And our filters are our unconscious mind. It's our biases. And immediately, within a fraction of a second, we are immediately developing assumptions. Is this going to be a good employee, bad employee? Is this going to be someone friendly I'm going to get along with, etc.? Okay. And then we, as a result of those assumptions, well, because of the weak handshake, they're insecure, fragile, I'm not going to hire them. And that's how our mind works. Again, we take that data, it processes it through our filters, we make assumptions, and all of that happens in a fraction of a second. And as a result, we decide not to hire someone, And that's how our mind works. Now, I want to talk about where these biases manifest themselves. And these biases come out when we communicate each other, and you're not even aware of it. So think to yourself for a second, something unique about how you communicate with each other. And think about, for example, do you move your hands and arms? And I tend to be an arm mover. My family always teases me because sometimes when I'm talking to them, I just start going like this with my hands and they start laugh. But actually think about who you do that with, who you don't. Maybe you're going to keep your arms crossed across your chest, and some you move your hands freely. Some people you speak very softly to, and some people you speak loudly to. What about your tone of voice? Is it gentle, more calming? Or is it more demanding and forceful? What about, are you a close talker or do you step back? Are you cognizant of the distance you have between the individuals you're talking to? Because that can convey a message. What about folding arms, as I mentioned? What about some people you regularly use sarcasm and jokes with, and others perhaps you always make a compliment to? And think about just these ways in which you're communicating, just by moving your hands, how you're holding your hands, the kind of comments or remarks you're making with someone. It all is a reflection of our unconscious mind, right? Our body is sending messages all the time, and we may not even know it. And the reason why we want to focus on that is because when you're having a dialogue, a communicating with someone, studies have shown that the words we actually use convey only 7% of the message. 93% of the message you're communicating is tone of voice and body language. And that includes hand gestures, eye contact, facial expressions, and posture. We communicate when we are talking and when we are not. And when we are not. And unfortunately, as I've been saying, a lot of times when we communicate with someone, and it may be just our tone of voice, our body language, it reflects our biases. It reflects our biases. And these type of messages, these communications that reflect our biases are what we call micro messages. They're subtle messages, usually subconscious, that values, encourages, discourages employees in the workplace. They are a reflection of our biases. Now, some micro messages can be positive, some micro messages can be negative. So, for example, you always see an employee and immediately smile. You see other employees coming down, your first reaction is to look away, right? And those are micro messages. You may not even be aware of what you're doing. And because micro messages often have a greater impact on those employees who are furthest from the social norm. What do we mean by that? Well, if your workplace only has one person of color, one person with a disability, one person of a certain ethnicity, when they are subject to experience your micro messages, they're more likely to think or believe it is related to their race, their gender, their national origin, their disability status. People who are furthest from the social norm, that are most unique and different, are more likely to have a negative impact when they're subject to these micro messages, and more likely to think that your particular behavior in this particular incident is related to their sex, race, national origin. So to give you some examples of micro messages, and this is actually one that I was guilty with just recently. Some of the associates in my office had a case, they were going to trial, and they asked me to come in to provide some feedback, some coaching on how to handle some particular issues. And as soon as I walked into that conference room, the first thing I did was pull out my cell phone and started looking at my text and emails. Okay. Now, I wouldn't do that with certainly some of the partners in my firm, but I did it with the associates. So what message would I convey? I was conveying that they were an appointment. It was very dismissive. And again, I wasn't even conscious. I certainly did not intend, if you want to say, to be dismissive or disrespectful, but I did it. There's something about those individuals that triggered in me, oh yes, I can look at my cell phone, look at my text messages. What about greeting some but all attendees at a small meeting or gathering? Okay, you say hello to some people, but not others. You constantly interrupting someone when they are speaking. I was involved with a case not too long ago, and this is a COVID-related issue, where a company was obviously working remotely, always having Zoom meetings. And a woman started to complain that every time she or another female on the team was talking, the male manager interrupted them. However, when a man on the team was talking, the manager never interrupted them. Now, we went to the manager, and the manager said, absolutely not. I would never treat someone differently in a meeting based on gender. And I believe if he took a lie detector test, he would actually pass, because he firmly believed he didn't treat anybody differently based on gender. But fortunately, most of these meetings were videotaped, and we actually looked through the videotape. And what we found was if a female on the team was speaking, the manager interrupted them 5 times more than if it was a male member of the team.
Not a surprise.
How do you explain it? This male manager had some bias. Mansplaining is a good example. You hear that term used, okay? For some reason, that manager just implicitly, unknowingly interrupted the females when they were talking. Addressing some employees in a familiar manner and some employees more formally. So I'm going to do a little exercise today. All right, I'm just going to say, go through it. Donna, great to see you. How's your family? Amy, it's a pleasure meeting with you. Hello, Chris. Michael, wonderful to see you again. Chris, how are you feeling right now? Did you notice any difference?
Yeah, you noticed me.
Okay. Well, but I just said hello to you, but I actually engaged in a little bit more detail. I guess I didn't do it well enough. But sometimes just the way you greet people, when you greet people very personally, very informally, but then someone comes around and you greet them very formally. Oh, hello, Chris, as opposed to Chris, nice to see you. How's your family? Okay. One is being obviously conveying something warm and positive, another a little bit more rigid and negative. Routinely being late for or leaving early for meetings. Think about who you do that to and who do you always show up on time. Okay. Other examples. Some employees you regularly ask them, how are you? And other employees you don't. How about who do you ask to go to coffee with in the afternoon for that 3 o'clock when you need 3 o'clock buzz? Who do you think you ask to go join you and who do you don't? Who do you give nickname to and what are those nicknames? Repeatedly forgetting a colleague's name. How about a male opening the door for an attractive woman, but when I'm not going to let you always off the hook, smiling warmly or flirting with an attractive man. Again, we would deny we do this, but you bet we do, right? Ridiculing speakers, accents, speech patterns of employees. And we can go on and on, okay? But again, our body language, our interactions, our communications reflect our biases, right? And why is it very important to focus on these micro messages? Because they absolutely do have an impact on individual employee performance, innovation, and engagement. Again, we want to get all our employees to the top of the mountain where they feel appreciated, valued, respected, because that's when they are going to give 100%, be more productive, industrious, more willing to help in hand. But if our employees are experiencing these micro messages from us as managers, then obviously that's going to result in a negative impact. Employee retention. Employees who are talented and are qualified, why will they want to work for a manager or for a organization that allows these micro messages to exist, or where the employees are constantly bombarded why their managers exist? And there's a direct correlation to employee retention and these micro messages existing in the workplace. And obviously, these micro messages contradict our core values. Our core values in all our organizations is to treat everyone with dignity, respect. But when we bombard them with these micro messages, okay, obviously they're not going to feel appreciated, value. So now I want to go to that question that Amy asked actually in the chat box. And how do we control what we cannot see? Because again, this all operates immediately in our unconscious mind automatically. And how can we held accountable for what we can't control? Again, they operate automatically. These biases come up. Well, I'm going to give you a 3-step process on how you can address these micro messages, how you can address these biases. Now, research has confirmed that when you openly acknowledge and admit that you have a bias, you can overcome them and refute them. So to share with you the example I gave you earlier, I've had for years, I've finally come to terms with it. I recognize I have a negative bias towards tattoos and piercings, but I love my son. His girlfriend is a wonderful woman. And so now I have absolutely sort of challenged myself that when I see someone with a tattoo, I immediately look at it and compare it to my son's. Boy, that's a beautiful tattoo. That was done clearly at 3 o'clock in the morning when someone is under the influence. I mean, I've actually focused and I've actually asked people, can I see that tattoo? And I've really sort of changed my mindset where now I actually have gone to tattoo parlors. I don't have any myself, but just to get that experience, because when you challenge it and really strive to refute those biases, you can overcome them. Now, I want to share with you something else, however. The people in our society, the people in the United States who actually scare me the most are the people who deny they have biases, deny their prejudice. Because research has shown that when you suppress or you deny these prejudice and biases, you actually increases that prejudice or bias. Okay, we are all biased. To be human has bias, is to be biases. So if you deny you have these biases and prejudices, you're actually reinforcing them. So I want to give you 30 seconds, and that's all I'm going to ask. I'm not going to ask you to disclose in any way, shape, or form. But right now, I want you to think about your own biases. Just think about your own biases. Take a moment of self-reflection and think about your own biases and how they exist, because we all have biases. And then once you have those biases, then think to yourself, all right, have these biases impacted my communications with my coworkers? Have these biases impacted my communications with my coworkers? Because I bet you they have.
Hmm.
All right, very good. Now let's go to step 2, and that is to appreciate and value diversity. Recognize that each person is different, unique. So very first and foremost, develop relationships beyond first impressions. Develop relationships beyond first impressions, because guess what? Our first impressions are biases working. Think back to that exercise we did earlier in terms of someone has a weak handshake, strong handshake, little something in their teeth, coffee stain in shirt, tattoos and piercing. Our unconscious mind, our implicit biases are immediately, automatically driving us to form an assumption about that individual. But first impressions are totally driven by our unconscious mind. Same with gut reactions. When you just got a sense or a feeling, okay, that that this is what I have to do, okay, that again is your first impression. So what I'm asking you to do is respond to what we talked about when Michael asked me that question earlier, is when you're making a decision, do you have credible, observable facts to justify that decision? Credible, observable facts. And that will get you out of making decisions based on your biases and instead making objective decisions based on the credible, objective facts. You never make decisions based on gut reactions. That's your implicit biases. Move past the discomfort of difference. Past the discomfort of difference. Typically, and this is part of what it means to be a human being, our mind tends to focus on us seeking commonalities. We tend to seek commonalities. What do I have in interest with that individual? We tend to associate people that have commonalities. I think back to when I grew up, and I was in a high school that was 50% black, 50% white. And even though I had black friends in the lunchroom, the black kids always associated together and the white kids always associated together because that was just our commonality. Our mind focused us to seek people who are similar to us. But if we're going to truly appreciate diversity, value diversity, we have to overcome the discomfort of difference and recognize and appreciate people for who they are. So some of the things may do is just ask someone, well, what are your plans for the weekend? What are you doing after work? Just show that you're interested and inquisitive about their particular interests. Also, if you have a very strong reaction to someone, whether it be positive or negative, step back and say, why? Why did I respond that way? So when you just saw someone who walked into the senior center, why did you automatically smile, have a warm, nice feeling? Or why did you automatically get concerned or frightened or feeling a little anxious. Ask yourself why. And oftentimes, when you ask yourself why, you can come to terms or recognize that you have biases. And lastly, step 3 is stop, look, and listen how you communicate with each other. When you're talking to your coworkers, your employees, think about every engagement and imagine how you're being perceived. And look in the mirror. So people who are very attuned to this, when you're speaking to someone, right? Look at how your coworkers, how your employees are responding to you. Are they looking at you a little inquisitively? Do they maybe take a step back? Do they cross their arms? Or maybe they smiling, they're nodding their head, they may be moving in closer, they seem more relaxed, they're smiling. The chances are you can read your audience. And by reading your audience, you can tell, all right, am I conveying some micro messages? Is there something about the way I'm talking? Am I talking more forcefully, more formally, more sternly, or am I more relaxed, calm, introspective, right? If you are really attuned, you can watch for cues from your audience, and your audience will actually be able to read your audience and tell, all right, is there something about my tone, my body language that maybe is conveying the wrong message here? Because remember, 93% of the message we convey is our body language and tone of voice. So with that, I want to share with you 2 quotes. And I think this really gets into what do we mean by creating a diverse and inclusive culture, and what happens when we're subject to these negative micro messages. So as Maya Angelou said, I've learned that people will forget what you said, people forget what you did, but people will never forget about how you made them feel. And that's the thing about micro messages. People may not be able to articulate what you actually said or did, nothing about your body language or tone of voice, but they will remember how you made them feel. And that impression is now going to go into their mind and form some bias about you. They may not be able to articulate anything about your body language, tone of voice, or what you said, but they will remember what they made you feel. And secondly, I always like quoting Mark Twain, who said, really great people make you feel that you too can become great. So what I'm asking you to do is to be sensitive to how you communicate with someone. And you could be the mentor and the role model, because you can make people feel great too. Now, just quickly, and I don't want to belabor this because I do want to get into any questions you have. But as leaders, I am going to suggest that you coach these micro messages when they arise. Anytime you see an employee with these micro messages, you should address it immediately. Always focus on observable behavior that is factual and accurate. If you remember our discussion on performance management and toxic employees, always focus on the facts, the specific observable facts. You never want to make assumptions. We don't want to work off opinions. We want to focus on facts. Always give the employee the opportunity to explain their side of the story. Always be a good listener. As I mentioned previous workshops, one of the things about us as managers, we tend to be poor listeners. But in order to do effective performance management, we have to give the employee the opportunity to explain their side of the story and listen attentively to the reasons, excuses they give. Counter stereotypical thinking. Simply because someone says, oh, some of the person ethnicity is X, Y, and Z, or some of the person race is A, B, and C. You got to carry those stereotypes, because stereotypes are based on biases and prejudices. And we have to overcome our stereotypical thinking. redirect to goals and core values. And our core values is always treat someone with dignity and respect. Start talking to the employees about stop, looking, and listen. Ask the employee, hey, how do you think your message was being perceived when you were yelling or raising your voice? You obviously need to develop positive, meaningful, trusting relationships with employees, but emphasize to your employees, proactive in talking to them about developing positive, trusting, meaningful relationships with each other. And at all times, it all comes down to maintaining dignity and respect. Okay, because when we engage in this micro message, when our biases come out, it counteracts our ability to create a dignified and respectful workplace. So just to put this in easy to understand, your leadership skills, recognize your biases, look beyond them, aspire to provide opportunity and support to everyone you work with, model inclusive behaviors, create positive, meaningful, trusting relationships, proactively discuss diversity and inclusion, have discussions about biases and how they can have an impact on the workplace, and very importantly, hold yourselves and others accountable. And if you take these steps, these essential leadership skills, you will absolutely be moving into the right direction and create a diverse and inclusive workplace where everybody feels appreciated, valued, respected. All right, I've been talking really fast and I apologize for that, but I want to make sure I get all this material in. So now I want to open it up to you. Does anybody have any comments they want to make? Any questions or concerns they have about anything we talked about today? And feel free to take yourself off mute because we have a small group here, so we don't need to use the chat box, but whatever's you're comfortable with.
And I would be interested in hearing about how you may be engaged in a conversation and your sense is that something is going south.
Sure.
So what are some ways of addressing that in the moment?
Sure. The immediately thing you can do if you're attuned to that is you could immediately stop and say, I'm sensing some negative vibes here. I'm sensing that my message is not going over well. I'm sensing that you have some concern about what I'm saying. Okay. If you seeing a negative reaction, immediately stop and say, hey, how is my message being perceived? Or do you have some concerns about what I am saying? You may step back and say, I didn't mean this to come over as being so forceful. I just want to talk about just some things that I'm sensing, but immediately ask your audience to respond because they may actually be able to articulate some of the concerns they have about your behavior. And that's just one of the ways you can address it in the moment. Any other questions, concerns? All right, Kathy, I just want to thank everybody for this group, for this presentation. Thank you for all indulging me. This is one of my favorite subjects. If we had more times, I'd use a lot more exercises, but hopefully I think you picked up something that's going to maybe think about how you interact with your employees. So if there's no other questions or comments, Kathy, I'll turn it back to you. Kathy, you still there?
Yes,
There
I
you go.
was muted. Thank you. And thank you so much. If I had a
You're
nickel
welcome.
for every time I've been told to unmute, I would be a wealthy woman. But anyway, and thank you so much. And
welcome.
And this MCOA event is now concluded and the recording device is now turned off. If you wish to remain online for a few minutes, if you want to check in with one another or if you have additional questions.